Okay, so we had a few little glitters today, but we are here live. Apologies. And this is our last LinkedIn Live. It's 31st of October, Halloween. And this is the end of ADHD Awareness Month. And we've got a special presentation for you from one of our coaches, Alex Smith, who, in line with the Halloween theme, is going to talk about. Alex, I'll leave it to you.
But what I'm going to talk about today is something called the five regrets of the dying. The five regrets of the dying was basically it was a book. It was originally a podcast, but it was a series of interviews with people who basically it was a palliative care nurse who basically interviewed people on their deathbeds as you know, at different ages, and that she distilled into that what people regretted, you know, when they realized they didn't have much life left. And where it's quite interesting, it's a bit of an alternative one, but the way it's quite interesting is because with ADHD, I work with quite a lot of people with what's a late diagnosis of ADHD. And by late diagnosis, I would say anyone that's been diagnosed with ADHD, probably not as a child, so you know, over the age of 15. I mean, I've worked a lot of people tend to get diagnosed with ADHD when either their own children are diagnosed or they realize, you know, the ADHD traits in themselves. It's because it's highly genetic, or in my case, it was very much, you know, children of my cousin were diagnosed. I was diagnosed with ADHD in my late 30s, age 38 or 39. The oldest client I've worked with got a diagnosis of ADHD in their 80s, and again, it was fantastic working with her, trying to kind of look at her life through an ADHD lens. And one of the things that people often ask me, firstly, is, you know, what's the value of a late ADHD diagnosis? And one of the obvious values is that you get legal access to medication, and like stimulant medication for some people it's a panacea. For a lot of people it's a plank in managing ADHD. I mean, stimulants can be incredibly useful in managing some of the core traits or core impairments of ADHD. But that's not something I'll really cover here. I mean, that's something that, you know, you could do a whole podcast on its own. I think what's more important is that a lot of people with ADHD have, you know, intuition, or, you know, a sixth sense, or, you know, the ability, you know, or empathy, or often ADHD strengths. A lot of people have a sense of what they need to do with ADHD, but without the ADHD diagnosis, they don't have the validation to effectively do what they know or what they think might work for them. So I think one thing that really helps people getting an ADHD diagnosis later in life is it gives them permission to do things differently, which is really, really helpful. And this is probably the key thing that I'm going to try and focus on today. You know, it's, if you're trying to spend a life trying to what I would say call out neurotypical people, it becomes an exhausting, it's demoralizing, it's frustrating, it's a zero-sum game, and you're not really competing on a level playing field, because you're basically competing with people that have got a brain that's wired very differently to you and are motivated very differently to you as well. So the way I often described having undiagnosed ADHD was, it's like everyone else. You know, I knew I was intelligent. I knew basically, I knew I had skills. I knew I had strengths, but in certain areas, and particularly in terms of day-to-day life and routines, it was like everyone else had a set of keys that I didn't have. The other thing that really often helps with a late diagnosis is some form of validation. There's a famous quote by Spike Milligan, the English comedian, and he wanted it. I think it was his epitaph. He wanted it on his gravestone. He said, "I told you I was ill," and it was basically, I think sometimes with ADHD is, you know, not actually having a sense of why, you know, what the root cause of your struggles is. It's very, very difficult if you don't know what you're fighting with, or you know what you've got. It's very, very difficult to kind of take steps to address it, and often again to give yourself the permission to do things differently. So I think validation and self-compassion for like past struggles is often quite vital things that emerge out of getting a late ADHD diagnosis. And when I work with clients with a lot of my clients, as I say, have come to me, you know, having been diagnosed with ADHD in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, even 60s, 70s, and 80s. And what you often see patterns with a late diagnosis, which are quite interesting. And I've just laid out on this slide what the kind of pattern that I see probably the most commonly with people, and it's definitely something that I went through when I got diagnosed myself. I think what you tend to get with the start is a sense of euphoria or a sense of excitement. You know, there's a huge relief and potentially some vindication for that some of often the unfair character traits that have been attributed to people. Often people are attributed with character traits that they simply don't have. It emanates from the executive function challenges inherent in ADHD. So what you tend to find is people first feel quite a lot of relief. They sometimes they get immediate relief from the medication, and that allows them to put into place strategies and often get coaching in the first place to support their ADHD. You often see that this is backed with like an insatiable curiosity. A lot of people with ADHD have what's either called it's often called a bingo brain, or I prefer the term magpie brain. It's like people, if they're interested in something, they ignite. They basically connect the dots. They research everything they can about what they're interested in. So when people get an ADHD diagnosis, often their interest is in that diagnosis. So I've often come to people, people often come to coaching with having read a huge amount about ADHD, having consumed a lot of information. Often it's having over a period of years read accounts of other people with ADHD that has actually convinced them that maybe this is what I'm struggling with all along myself. So a lot of people, it's a kind of a slow burning process. By the time they get diagnosed with ADHD, personally, I think I suspected I had ADHD for about 10 years before I got an official diagnosis. Then what tends to happen is there's a little bit of a crash. Basically, what people experience is sometimes the medication's often a plank rather than a panacea. It's helpful, but it doesn't remove ADHD. You still have ADHD. So I think a lot of people, they then start looking at their lives through that ADHD lens, and like basically often you see a sense of resentment, a sense of anger. I kind of felt a huge sense of loss, that had I known earlier that I had ADHD, it would have given me the permission to do things differently or to advocate more stridently for what I needed. And this is very much my main I was an executive coach for a number of years before getting an ADHD diagnosis, but my main motivation for specializing in coaching for ADHD and wider executive functioning was that I just wish I'd had someone like me to speak to 20 years ago, or 20 years before my ADHD diagnosis. And that's not necessarily saying it's about me as a coach, but having someone who could understand through an ADHD lens, it just gives you a context that you otherwise would not have. One of the things I really emphasize with clients, and particularly in introductory calls, is what I will not try and do as a coach is what I don't want to do is make people like a model of ADHD effectiveness. People aren't robots with ADHD. And I think what I often get people to reflect on, or what clients to reflect on, is what were what I call their maladaptive adaptive strategies. So what have they done in the past that has worked? It might have stopped working, life might have changed, but a lot of the time, even potentially negative strategies, actually give you clues as to what people with ADHD need. It's what level of stimulation you need, what environments your skills most naturally show up, what outlets you need for your energy. So what I remind clients quite a lot is if you've got to like 30, 40, 50, 60 with undiagnosed or misdiagnosed ADHD or unsupported ADHD, you've done a hell of a lot right. It might have been at huge personal cost. It might have had huge impact on your mental health or your physical health. A lot of people have very, very, very kind of uneven or roller coaster lives with ADHD, but there will be a lot of clues in what you've already done to try and support your ADHD that we can then use in coaching to basically construct a life that works better for you, or environments that allow you to succeed more reliably. There's three questions I tend to ask people in relation to this. The first one is, what do you do when you're winging it? People with ADHD, are very good at winging it, and in a very positive sense. Intuition, creativity, curiosity, the ability to connect disparate ideas, like non-linear thinking. All of these are ADHD strengths. And what people with ADHD are very good at is reinventing themselves, finding things that work for themselves. So in the past, you might have found things, that hobbies or ways of working that might have been unconventional or might have been seen as eccentric by your peers or your colleagues, but they probably point to something that you needed to actually thrive with ADHD. And the more you understand, what was the ADHD root of those strategies, the more you can find similar strategies in the future. Or, I often talk about coaches finding like a menu of strategies. The more you can find a menu of things that work or give you certain benefits that you can, go back to or change up as you get bored of them, the more you tend to thrive with ADHD. Another one is that often a big challenge with ADHD is that people in education and typical office environments are working to neurotypical norms. You're working to the majority. So like the 9 to 5 job, the way in which the days are structured, whilst they might work for most neurotypical people, often don't work very well for people with ADHD. People have to do things differently in a different order. They have to work to different rhythms. So another question I tend to ask people is, what do you do when there are no shoulds? And a really good example of this is holidays. Most people, when they're on holiday, there are no shoulds. There aren't obligations as to when you get up, how you manage your time, when you exercise, when you eat, how you do things, how you manage your energy. And often what people do naturally on holiday with ADHD gives a huge amount of clues as to how they need to structure their days when they're not on holiday. They have to be often more flexible, more creative in how they use their time, more creative in how they protect their time and their energy. The third one is the situational variability. I think one of the things that frustrates a lot of people with ADHD, but also kind of leads to a lot of negative labeling around the condition, is that the skill set is very, very uneven. It's inconsistent. At times it's exceptional, at times it's brilliant. Consistently having ADHD can be a bit crap. And that's often the challenge that you have, because people often make assumptions based on that. If you're very, very capable in certain situations, which most people would say find difficult, people assume, well, surely you should be capable in lesser situations, where things are less difficult. But that is very much the paradox of ADHD. In certain environments, in certain contexts, strengths show up. In other contexts, those very same things, like the ability to organize, the ability to focus, the ability to pay attention, are very much compromised. So it's a very uneven skill set. And I think what I often ask people is, where are the exceptions? In which environments are you happiest? Which environments do you naturally thrive? And the more you become conscious of what's present and what's absent in those environments, the more you can recreate similar environments in the future. And this is so, as a precursor to like 5 regrets of the dying, what I've summarized here is, from my years of coaching people with ADHD, what are the 5 main regrets, or a combination of the 5 main regrets of people who have received a late ADHD diagnosis. And this is how I would summarize them. There's regrets in, not everyone has regrets in all 5 of these areas, but I would say, broadly speaking, most people with ADHD that I've worked with who've had a late diagnosis express some regrets in some or either or all of these 5 areas. So the first one you see is like regrets at their inconsistency, and often the labels that they've been given as a result of this inconsistency, either by themselves or others. It's a very inconsistent skill set, ADHD, and I think what you tend to find is people often label themselves as a result of that, because they can't consistently fulfill their potential, or it's a very kind of like roller coaster ride. The 2 things I often get labeled with, one is being lazy or kind of feckless, inconsistent, things around unmotivated. The other things that they get labeled with is being uncaring. If they forget things, they forget people's birthdays, they turn up late for meetings, it's seen as like disrespectful or uncaring, or lacking in respect of other people's time. And yet I've never, in all the clients I've worked with ADHD, I've never come across anyone who's fundamentally lazy, and I've never come across anyone that's uncaring. Most people with ADHD are exactly the opposite. They're people pleasers. They're incredibly conscious, often overly conscious of their impact on others. The next one is regrets stemming from a sense of unfulfilled or intermittently fulfilled potential. A lot of people with ADHD have a sense that they've got a contribution still to make, a legacy still to leave on the world, and everyone with ADHD's got a book to write or a song to be written, and creativity, curiosity, this ability to connect things that they're interested in and to motivate others in areas of interest are huge ADHD strengths. And a lot of people, like procrastination or uncertainty about whether their skills will show up, prevent them from actually really showcasing their true strengths. Third one is around what I would call compare and despair regrets. It's compare and despair is something that's comes out of CBT particularly, but it comes out more from kind of therapy than it does from coaching. But a lot of people with ADHD have this consciousness of difference, basically. one of my clients said, I'm not very good at adulting, but by adulting, he meant living consistently as what a responsible adult should do day to day. Other people refer to similar things related to that. I'm not very good at being mothering or fathering or partnering. And again, it's kind of like a half truth. It's like what they're often referring to is they're not necessarily as effective at kind of partnering or mothering or fathering in a neurotypical way. On their own terms, people with ADHD can be very effective in all of these areas and often offer things that are very, very different to like a neurotypical partner or someone who hasn't got the ADHD brain wiring. Fourth set of regrets stem around if only I'd known I had ADHD regrets. And a lot of people with ADHD are very intuitive. I mean, I often talked about my intuition as a sixth sense. When I'm mentally well, when I'm comfortable in an environment, my intuition, my gut feeling leads me very, very well. And a lot of clients say similar. But what if you don't have the ADHD lens or the ADHD understanding? What's very, very difficult is to defend your own position. You might know something's instinctively right for you, but if you don't have the ADHD context to explain that to yourself and then to other people, it's very difficult to defend your own needs and set your own boundaries. Final one is like what I call 1 step forward, 2 steps back regrets. A lot of things that we get drilled into us at school are things like practice makes perfect and you reap what you sow, things like that. Or another classic one is fail to prepare and prepare to fail. All of these things with ADHD are largely not true. I mean, what you tend to find with ADHD is people find it very, very difficult to harness past experiences to predict future outcomes. They also struggle to remember what's present. It's often called self-monitoring or self-reporting. They struggle to remember what's present and what's absent when things are going well and when things are going badly. And if you don't have that context, it's very difficult to recreate those environments in the future. So the other thing you often find with ADHD is that people don't get through for being able to do things in advance of doing them. Things like revision are very, very difficult because they don't. What you tend to find with ADHD is that your knowledge or your skill set shows up when you need it and never beforehand. It's why often people with ADHD are as good in a crisis as they are struggling when there is an absence of a crisis. So this kind of then brings me on to the actual book that I referenced at the start, which was a book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying, A Life Transformed by the Dearly Departed. It's a book that I really recommend anyone read. I mean, it's available on Audible. It's also available as a podcast as well. It was originally a podcast as well. What this was based on, it was observations by someone called Bronnie Ware, who was basically a palliative carer who basically spent a lot of time conversing with people on their deathbed, so of different ages, so who were dying. And then what she distilled from that is, in the conversations she had with them, what did they regret not having done with their lives? And these were basically what she argued was, or what she kind of established as the top 5 regrets of the dying, but regrets in the 5 areas listed here. So the first one is people often said in different ways, I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the lives others expected of me. So basically being authentic, following their own goals rather than those of other people. Another one was a lot of people, particularly men in this regard, regretted spending time at the office. So it doesn't need much explanation. This one, I wish I hadn't worked so hard was a second one. I wish I hadn't missed out on seeing my children grow up or missed out on travel or opportunities because I was spending all of my life in the office. Third one was, I wish I'd had the courage to express my feelings. Again, quite self-explanatory, that one. Fourth one was basically, I wish I'd stayed in touch with my friends. So it was very much around connection. I think one of the things that's hugely important in ADHD is extrinsic connection. People are very extrinsically motivated. They often take their motivation from other people or the environment. So connect, and again, one of the things that came across a lot of this is how people have basically, as life had gone on and like in families and jobs had got in the way, they'd lost touch with friends who'd formed vital parts of their life. And the final one was a permission one. It was basically, I wish I'd allowed myself or let myself be happier. And so again, the reason I find these regrets kind of actually quite inspiring from an ADHD perspective is that they're completely distinct from the kind of regrets that people express, and almost like diametrically opposed from the regrets that people express about not having been diagnosed with ADHD earlier. Here there's an absence of you know, things like consistency or sustainability or having a very linear life. But this is where I think, you know, ADHD, it can be helpful from an ADHD perspective. I mean, as I just said, like, so the regrets of the dying and the late ADHD diagnosis regrets are so incredibly radically different. You know, if you look at the regrets of the dying, they boil down to kind of things like basically authenticity. You know, they regret having to mask, you know, people regret having to have masked their true selves, or having to operate to standards, values, expectations, and dreams which weren't their own. You know, they basically regret not being authentic, not living lives that they wanted to live, or that they instinctively felt were right for them. Similarly, people didn't regret, you know, the kind of consistency, the predictability elements of life. If anything, they regretted the fact that their lives had been consistent and predictable. They regretted spending too long at the office. They regret, you know, too long on the kind of shoulds of life, of, you know, making money, saving for the family, being a provider, and not enough time on actually enjoying, you know, the benefits of their work, and not having, you know, time to spend with people, the freedom to do the things they wanted, or putting those things on hold for a later time, which when they were dying, they realized they then had no longer the time to do. So what's quite interesting with ADHD is, in many ways, ADHD, if you live a life authentic to your ADHD, it should in many ways protect you from the kind of regrets of the dying, those 5 key regrets of the dying. People with ADHD tend to be spontaneous, they're impulsive, and often, you know, they're nearsighted in the way that they think. And that can be both a blessing and a curse. And it's often described as well that, you know, people with ADHD are sprinters and not marathon runners. So I think what I often say to clients is, you know, what are you putting on hold? You know, where are you trying to live a life that's not authentic to yourself? And another thing with ADHD is that people never feel ready to do anything. And a lot of people describe ADHD as this, you know, waiting to feel perfectly motivated. That never comes with ADHD. What you tend to find is that if you trust your intuition, your knowledge shows up when you need it and never beforehand. The right combination of urgency, of interest, and the unambiguity of focus, people with ADHD tend to thrive. They tend to be hyperfunctional, not dysfunctional at all. So this is basically the conclusion that I draw, and where I try and help clients and use the 5 regrets of the dying, which seems quite morbid, to actually be a force for positive rather than a force for negative, is in this. You know, basically, I think with ADHD to thrive, you have to give yourself permission to do things differently. And often the key thing to be able to start doing that is actually getting that accurate diagnosis of ADHD, and then potentially as a result of that diagnosis, pursuing some combination of medication and then coaching. So there's 5 questions I tend to ask people in that regard, in terms of, you know, helping them to actually construct lives which are going to allow them to be happy and thrive with ADHD. First one of those 5 questions is, what are your outlets for restlessness? And most people with ADHD, you know, have energy to burn. Basically, they need outlets for their energy. They need to be stimulated. Often people experience boredom like pain with ADHD. So, and those outlets for restlessness don't have to be big E exercise outlets. You know, some people, they are. You know, a lot of people are heavily reliant on exercise to manage their ADHD. So they do things like run marathons. You know, I personally use a lot of cycling as one of the big, probably more so than medication. My most effective way of managing my own ADHD is through cycling. But for a lot of people, it's like much lesser. It's like, you know, walking around cities, basically just getting their 10,000 steps, being out and about. But it's having outlets to move, basically, and to not be stuck and not be sedentary. Second one is, and it's often interlinked, if you can find outlets for restlessness that are also outlets for curiosity, all the better. But what the second one is, what are your outlets for curiosity or creativity or interest? People with ADHD, you know, have a brain wired for interest. In the absence of interest, they wither. So for some people, that is finding a job that they're passionate about or that they value. For other people, it might be finding a job that allows them to pursue a passion outside of work. You know, if the job allows them to pursue another interest kind of quite systematically outside of work, that can be protective. But however you find it, there has to be something that allows for your curiosity or your creativity or interest to thrive. I think the best you can do as a coach, if someone is doing something in which they have no interest, is you can shore up their weaknesses. It's very, very difficult to allow to get their strengths to come to the fore. The third one is the environmental variability of ADHD. One of the biggest weapons you have with ADHD is to change the environment in which you do something. Doing something in one environment, and then doing the same thing in another environment can be revelatory. And it's like, body doubling can be revelatory with ADHD, having other people in the same environment doing the same things as you. So the questions I often ask people in that regard is, what do you need from the environment and from other people to thrive? Who or what in the environment and in other people ignites energy for you? And what are your energy vampires? What sucks energy away from you? A lot of people are very, ADHD energy is very seductive, but you have to be very, very careful, because other people will latch onto that and will drain that energy from you. So it's absolutely critical is putting yourself in the right environments and surrounding yourself with the right people. Fourth one is, where can you be your authentic self? Where are you forced to mask your true self? If you're always masking your true self or having to kind of compensate for your weaknesses, that's exhausting. It's not something that's sustainable in the long run. So what's more useful is to think about, how do you need to structure your day? What rhythms do you need to work to? What's the right balance between work and living? How it's basically, in what environments are your strengths naturally going to surface, and what are those strengths? And the more you understand what those strengths are and where they surface, the more you can better recreate those environments in the future. Finally, it's basically, it's often a risk thing. A lot of people with ADHD are putting their lives on hold, and it makes sense logically, because a lot of people, if you don't get a reliable sense of your skills, if your knowledge doesn't if when revising for things or preparing for things, you don't get a sense that you're making progress, the greatest tragedy I see with ADHD is people then don't do the thing because they can't prove that they can do things in advance. They then don't do those things. If you said to someone with ADHD, book a driving test or book an exam when you're ready to do so, they would never ever book a driving test. Yet what tends to happen, and what I found happened in my exams, is in the final exams I experienced almost an inner calm, because it was a do or die moment. My skills connected, my knowledge connected in a way that it never connected when revising for exams. So a lot of people, what they find is when they actually take risks and put themselves, and do things in accordance with their own values, their knowledge is there. It shows up when they need it and never beforehand. So in that sense, it's kind of like trusting your instinct, trusting that your knowledge will be there when you need it. And that's the final message that I would just try and, both for myself and like for my clients and for people that I would work with in the future and people that are just getting ADHD diagnosis now, is a bit at the top of this slide. It's basically, with ADHD, what you're not trying to do is, we're not trying to make you definitely not trying to remove your ADHD. I couldn't do that if I wanted to. It's not, as a coach, I can't remove your ADHD. As a coach, what I also can't do is I can't basically find a perfect solution for every aspect of your ADHD forevermore. If we found that solution, what would happen is you'll soon get bored of it. And basically, there's always that need to reinvent with ADHD and to resparkle. Things will fizzle out. But what you can do with ADHD and what you can do with coaching for ADHD is help people to create a life that works with and not against their ADHD. And once they've done it, to then defend it and pursue it unapologetically. And that's not making ADHD an excuse for everything. But what it's saying is that basically, the more you operate in accordance with your own brain wiring and your own strengths, the more life becomes sustainable with ADHD, the more it isn't a fight just to keep your head above water.